Hello. How's it going out there? You hear me okay? Well, according to the audio, it looks good. Hello. How are you doing today? That's good. I tweaked my audio settings earlier today to try to muffle out or get rid of some of the backup sound. And apparently I didn't turn off notifications. Yay. Things you learn. It's a virtual machine I use, so I don't even normally get notifications on it. So I will just turn them all off. Where did the Star Effects ceiling cans go? They are now hidden. I worked on some of the video and audio over the weekend to try and clear things up a bit. There is a backdrop behind me now. It showed up on Friday. Unfortunately, I can't green screen it out because no matter what variables I try, I just can't get settings right to get rid of it. So right now you are looking at a really close backdrop. Hopefully by next week I'll have the green screen in place and we'll be able to just mirror it out so you only see my face in the beginning. So I'm eliminating distractions outside of my face. The only thing I can really do about that is just hide the webcam or not. Yes, it's supposed to be black, but it comes out as kind of like a dark grayish, light blackish. Problem is the green screen is not straight. It's supposed to bend and fold into a small circle, but it's been bent so long. I need a little pancake on my forehead. Nice. The glare too much? How's that? Is that better? So the background is not even, so it was very challenging to get the coloring out. So I'm going to focus today on kicking off. So I put together a blog post slash outline for the way this stream is going to go, and I probably should have brought that up before, but if you go to github.com/JoeG I'm running two virtual machines right now, plus something else to try for the overall look. See if I can get more out of the machine. So might be a bit slow, especially a VM within a VM, I guess, right? So we're going to be focusing mostly on this application going forward. And it's essentially a net new app we're going to build from the ground up, starting with just a walk through the IDE. If you want to follow along with what we're going to do, we can click on the outline or view this, and this will cover our application flow from beginning to end. So today we'll work on, and maybe a little bit tomorrow, work on just an introduction to the IDEs. So these are the integrated development environments that we're going to be using. We'll probably be mixing back and forth between Visual Studio, Visual Studio Code, and JetBrains Writer. We're then gonna work on the model development. So we're going to build out our business layer and kind of show how we test that business layer out. Then we're going to work on putting that into a database of some sort. We'll probably start off with SQL Server at first, and then later on, much later on, we'll move into the something else like Cosmo DB, or maybe a JSON file, or maybe DynamoDB. We'll figure that stuff out. And then we'll work on database mapping, because we don't want to tie the database to the actual, or the implementation to our actual domain. Then we'll talk about how we expose that business layer that we put together into an API. So once we get the API working, we're then going to validate it in one or many steps. We'll use a combination of Postman, HTTP request, and the HTTP client as part of Writer. Now that we have that API, we're going to take that and move it off to the cloud. So we'll work on setting up a pipeline to deploy our application straight to the cloud. And these are some ideas of what technologies we're going to use going forward. Then we're going to publish the API, which, like I mentioned, we'll be using either Azure Pipelines or GitHub Actions, or maybe both. Then we'll implement API authentication and then build one or more client applications. We'll do ASP.NET Core. We'll build a Blazor app. We'll work on some native applications using React Native or Ionic. We might even get into WinForms. Then we're going to take that whole application architecture and give it a look over and say, how do we go and make some changes to it? So we'll take out the database and totally swap out the database and put something else in there and see how the application behaves. Hopefully this will take us a couple of weeks to build. Again, these are going to be like hour-long sessions. And the idea behind it is we want to see an app from the file new all the way to completion and try to adapt when things change. As we complete different features, here I'm going to put in the recording for the talk or whatever we do here on Twitch, and then any commits that were made for it so that you can go and follow along as needed. So without further ado, let's go and kick off our IDEs. First one we're going to introduce is Visual Studio 2019. This is the latest preview version from Microsoft as of Saturday. There was an update on Sunday, but based on some of the Twitter feedback, I decided not to upgrade to it because for a lot of people's machines, it was busted. So we're not going to go through the creating of a project now. We'll probably do that either tomorrow or Thursday. Let's just kind of walk through the overall. So as soon as you start Visual Studio, assuming you didn't double click on a solution or a project file in Windows Explorer, you will get this dialog box. Has your most recent changes here, or your most recent files you've opened. You can search for files if you have a lot of them. On this particular virtual machine, I've only opened one file on it so far. Or you can directly clone or check out from something like GitHub, TFS, Azure DevOps. You can open up an existing one, open up a blank folder, or create a new project. We're going to go and choose this option, which apparently is the least favorite because it's just a hyperlink underneath to continue without code. Once you do that, it opens up the IDE, again, Integrated Development Environment. You'll notice your appearance may vary depending on what default settings you have. Right now I am using the dark theme and the Visual Studio Visual C# developer settings. So these have shortcuts and key combinations as well as a window layout that is geared towards C# development. So a little look at what we have here. So in the lower right hand corner you see this new pop-up. This is what they call notifications. This tells us, gives you little tidbits of things to do. In this case, it's telling me that version 16.6.0 preview for Visual Studio 2019 is available. I can click on view details and it'll tell me about it. I'm just going to dismiss that right now because I don't want to do it. You'll see here there's a list of other notifications. If I click on that, I'll get a list of notifications in a new window. This is typically where application updates are you're notified of. So here I have 4 plugins or 4 extensions into Visual Studio that are available, or sorry, 3, as well as Visual Studio itself. So I'm just going to ignore those for now. So a little bit about the IDE in general. You have your menu here, a quick search. If there's any shortcuts available with Visual Studio, it'll display them in parentheses. In this case, Control Q will get you quick search. This, luckily or unluckily or not, your copy of Visual Studio won't have my face on it. It has whatever face you're signed in with. If not, it just displayed it's a generic circle. But this gives you the Microsoft account that you're signed in with, and you can do other things with it. You then have a toolbar. The toolbar varies depending on what you have open and closed in here. If I open up a project file, additional items will be on here. If I'm working in a C# file, different menu items will be available here. If you click on here, just like any Windows app, you can add and remove your settings. Outside of that, you have what are called tool windows within Visual Studio. These are these items that are, in most cases, docked to the side. So right now we see this notifications one that is in blue. That happens to be my default desktop color for what Windows considers active windows. So right now notifications is active. And you'll notice that there are 3 individual buttons. The buttons vary depending on the type of window. This allows you to see the window positions, and windows can be positioned in either way. You see I have one here docked to the bottom, one here tabbed off to the side, and then another one here that's pinned. The notifications is what's called, and this toolbox are what's called auto hidden, meaning that when they're not in focus, if I go elsewhere, they go away, but they're still available to be clicked on. You can also click and drag this. You'll notice you have a couple of different positions that you can throw stuff into. As I'm clicking and dragging, I have the ability to dock it to the top, dock it to just this window here, which is this square here, or to the side. If I click on it, it automatically shows you where it goes. Or I can add it to an existing one. Since this is its own frame, I can dock it to it, put it on its side, anywhere. So your mileage may vary. This gets saved off with every particular person. The pin allows you to hide it or auto hide. So right now my Solution Explorer is normally pinned because I like to see that open all the time. If you want to auto hide something, you just hit the minus or the little pin button, and it kind of pulls the pin and has it auto hidden. If you don't want to see it anymore, you click on the red X and it won't be there anymore. That doesn't mean it's gone. You can always get back to it by view, and then one of these windows, if it's something that's native to Visual Studio. In this case, there are about 30 different native ones. But if you click on other windows, you can see some of the other ones that you can bring up and back. Your mileage may vary. Some of these are installed based on plugins or add-ins I have to Visual Studio, like the data tools operations, live share, and code metrics. So to open up a solution in Visual Studio, you click File, Open, choose Project Folder, Website. We're just going to open up an existing one just to kind of show what the Solution Explorer is. So I'm going to choose Project. Up will come a list. By default, Visual Studio puts your projects in a folder called My Documents, Visual Studio, whatever version number it is, and then projects. So it would typically be My Documents / Visual Studio 2019 / projects. For me, I have it changed to open up directly into a project directory. Let's actually see how you do that first, because there's lots of options that you'll want to change when you first get started. So you go to Tools and then Options in Visual Studio. Wait a week to 10 days, depending. Your mileage may vary depending on whether or not you're running in a virtual machine, on a Macintosh, and how many plugins you have. So this list varies tremendously depending on what you have. Some of the ones out of the box that I can tell you are add-ons are Azure Data Lake, Azure Dev Spaces, Azure Service Authentication, Live Share, Node.js Tools, Service Fabric, and a couple others. Most of the ones that you are going to be concerned with are typically in the environment, project and solutions, text editor if you want to get fancy, and then everything else kind of comes with experience as you start playing around with. So it defaults into the environment, which right now I have it set to the theme of dark. There are 4 out of the box ones. There's actually a website, if you Google Visual Studio's themes, that has a couple of hundred themes on it. For most cases, most people will use the light theme, which is out of the box, and never change it. I change it to dark because I tend to like it more. I didn't first like it, but it kind of grew on me. And it's also easier when I'm doing presentations, when people are looking at code for long periods of time. It reduces the strain on your eyes. Let's see, what else? Apply title casing. This was a feature that was added in 2018. I'm not going to go through every one of them for you, but you can actually open them up and see more about it. So the general is always the first task. What accounts you have. Here I only have one registered account. If you're doing development on AWS or Amazon Web Services, you can add, you can also see an account here. This also allows you to register more than one Azure account. If I have one for work, one for personal, right now I only have my personal one registered. Most of the other settings you don't really change. Some people change the fonts and colors, and I made the mistake of clicking it because this is one of the longest loading settings boxes here, but this allows you to change the individual fonts per each window. Right now I think I just have my default, which I call JoeG default settings, which enable me to show stuff using the source code Pro medium, which has a very distinct look geared towards source code. A lot of people are starting to use the JetBrains Mono font, which is actually a really good one. I just haven't updated this virtual machine with it, and there are countless others. What else did we change here? That's most of the changes. If you want to change the document path, You don't click on this documents, you click on project and solutions. There's a where is it? Locations, where you can change the default settings. In this case, it's set to C users, JoeG source repos, but you can change it to everything else you want. Two things to note: the user project templates location and user item templates location. This you typically do not want on a network drive. And if you're in a large corporation, a lot of times your My Documents is shared off on a network drive. What that ends up doing is every time you do file new or something like that, Visual Studio goes out to network, and depending on your network, that could take forever. Like where I work right now, especially with us working from home, I'm going through a VPN, so everything was shared off to a network server, which meant I would have to go from here through our VPN into our internal network onto our shared drive to get the files and back and forth. So this is usually one of the first things you change to put that local, and all that is modifying it here and copying and pasting the files to your new desktop or your new location. Let's see, I think that's about it for there. So let's go and open up a sample project and see what it looks like. Let's go to projects, and then I think the Contoso University has enough in it that we can kind of see the differences. So I'm going to click open, get to, oh, it's just a project. So there's only one project for that. So I would actually want to open up something with a solution so we can see the differences between them. So let's open up this. eShop on the web is something, if you Google or Bing or Escape, whatever your preferred search engine is, you can download this source code for it. So Visual Studio right now is processing the solution file and getting it ready to show us. It's going to list all the files that are part of the solution here in the Solution Explorer. Now if you notice, there's a common theme of Explorer. This being a Microsoft product, they went with the whole Windows Explorer theme, Internet Explorer, and so on. You notice this is a little bit slower, mostly because I'm working in a virtual machine, plus the streaming, plus the recording. So here with this solution, we're not going to walk through the solution, but just kind of show some of the stuff Visual Studio does. So the solution is an aggregation of one or more projects or items. Think of a solution as the entire package of what you're working on. Solutions within in the Microsoft sense, when it comes to Visual Studio and .NET development, are geared towards projects. So this particular case has 3 projects that we can see at the root. They're in the source folder. One is called Application Core, one is called Infrastructure, and one is called Web. And then there is a folder called Tests. Folders are optional within Visual Studio. A lot of people kind of do it to get more organized. Here they organize their tests within 2 categories, within 3. Functional tests, integration tests, and unit tests. And we'll be covering those in future streams about the differences between tests as we build them out. In this particular case, there is a Docker Compose file. We're probably not going to talk about Docker on this stream for quite some time out. Okay, so if you open up any one of these, we'll go with the Application Core for right now. You'll see it's broken up of one or more folders. There's also these little blue padlocks. If you hover over them, it says checked in. This means that it is inside of a version control repository, something like a TFS, Team Foundation server, or GitHub, or GitLab, or SVN, something that keeps a copy of source code. That would be a whole nother discussion for another time. As we open up any one of these, we'll see different icons. The basic look and feel is very similar to Windows Explorer. There's one or more icons and then the name of it. So this is an icon for a C# project. And this is the name of that project, Application Core. Underneath that, there are dependencies. Underneath that, we have multiple folders with source code in it. If you open that up, we can see the different pieces of source code by opening up any of the CS things. Oh wow. Gumshoe Noir, I noticed I just got an alert that 99% of my frames were dropped in the last 2 minutes, so I'm guessing that was me. Must have been something happening in the background that killed it. So give it a minute to let it catch up. Make sure that we're back and running. Okay, the frames stopped dropping, so it should be good for a little bit. So here, if we double click on the base entity, Visual Studio is going to open that into what's called the text editing window, which would appear right here. Let me just do a quick thing and shut down these unneeded applications until we are ready for them to free up some CPU usage. I pulled up a pretty empty project, but essentially what this window does is allows you to do the text editing or creating the source code for your project. You'll see the title of the window here, just like the other windows. You'll be able to pin or unpin them. I'll be able to close them. You'll see 3 different navigation lists here. This is the overall higher level class of where it is. So in this case, the C# project application core. The current class that we're in, which is base entity, and the current ID, or the current function name. In this case, we're in the ID function. If I go to something a little bit bigger, like let's get out of the core and go into infrastructure and data. If I open up this one, you'll see the drop-down list actually has a lot more. I can click on it and see multiple. In most cases, if your application is designed according to most standards and best practices, this will only ever have one item, this will only ever have one item, and this will have more than one item. But we'll go through those as we progress. You see we have an error window. Right now there are no errors and any output. Within the output, these are different application messages that come across. These can be from plugins, these can be from Visual Studio. The source varies depending on what you currently have running. Right now I only have the package manager and source code control of Git. If I clicked on Git, it says that I'm opening up the repository. If I decide to check out something or do a change with it, this will give me the feedback as to what we're doing. Okay, that's a quick 10,000 foot view of Visual Studio. We're going to kind of move over to Visual Studio Code right now, which is Microsoft's free cross-platform version of it. So let's close that out. For sake of the stream, I'm going to shut down the VM, and then we will move over to back to Windows, or back to the Mac, and open it back up. Just bear with me for a second. Okay, trigger the shutdown. Now let's go and start off Visual Studio Code. Hopefully, most people know the difference between Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code now. Visual Studio Code was a new version of Visual Studio written from the ground up. Sorry, it started on a different screen. And it was written using a technology called Electron. Electron pretty much provides the shell for Visual Studio. Think of it as the car that does the transportation for you. It's essentially a shell that gets you from point A to point B, but you sit inside the car. So there are a lot of applications that are written using Electron or something similar. A lot of Google applications are. We have this, we have Azure Data Studio, as well as a couple of different apps. Benefits of Electron is it allows you to run in more than one scenario. Essentially, behind the scenes, you're writing the application in JavaScript, and then the Electron shell hosts your application around. It's probably the bandwidth right now of shutting down the virtual machine. So let's wait a second. It's still shutting down in the background. So how's everyone's day going? Have a mental note. Don't use VM during stream. Now it's shut down, so hopefully my CPU and everything can get back to normal. And we'll see. Things getting better now. Is it not as choppy now? Must be really bad if no one can respond in chat. Okay, good. Thanks, Adam. Might have to turn out to do like a lot of people mentioned and host your stream on a different computer than the one you're actually working on. So I guess I'm gonna go to Amazon and spend $150 on the video capture card after this. Okay, so Visual Studio Code, where I left off, this this is Microsoft's free forte into IDEs. It's become hugely popular amongst the Java, React, anything but Microsoft community because one, it's free and it's actually quite powerful. You notice a lot of the look and feel is very different from Visual Studio Code that we saw earlier. Mostly because of certain limitations as far as what the applications can host and to have that true cross-platform availability. So just like the Visual Studio portion of this, Visual Studio Code IDE might look different than yours. Even more so because I have a green icon for it. The green icon indicates that I'm using the Insiders version, which is a preview version of this. So this is the latest and greatest. As they commit builds and it goes past all the testing, they make the latest version available, and then my machine automatically downloads it, which is a good thing and a bad thing. One time that bit me in the rear just before I got on stage. There was an automatic update that got applied and it broke the keyboard, meaning you could not type at all, which is really hard when you're about to do a demo like this or on stage in front of 200 people and your keyboard doesn't work. But that's another story altogether. So this is what's called the welcome page. It provides that similar experience to when we opened up Visual Studio. Okay, I'm not seeing any notifications in the last 2 minutes. So everything looks like it's good on my end. The audio looks good. I haven't done anything with this screen differently. The screen has been the same, so there's been no updates to it. But you'll see here we have the new file, open folder, add workspace folder. Workspaces try to accomplish the same thing that Visual Studio has as far as solutions, to allow you to group or categorize items in more than one folder. And then the more recent projects, this lists the top 5 and then help across the board. And these are different ways to customize it. Along the side to the left, we have the different windows that are available. Most of them are going to kind of be grayed out because it's just the color scheme that I have. If I click on this one, it gives me the ability to see what files. This is kind of the equivalent to the Solution Explorer in Windows in Visual Studio Code. This is a search, allows you to search and replace. This is source code, so allows me to go and change source code. This is my start stop, aka run menu. This is all the extensions. I click on here. This has all the plugins and everything that I have within my environment. You'll notice I have quite a few. It's just things you acquire over time as you're developing. The first 5 or 6 you see are Angular specific that help with Angular. It's one of the nice things about Visual Studio Code is its community, it's open source, but it's pretty bare bones and plain. It's basically a really good version of Notepad.exe or TextEdit or Notepad++. And then what gives it its true power is all the integrations that happen. So all these extensions. So writing code in Angular is an extension. Writing code in C# is an extension. These are all things to plug in that makes Visual Studio Code aware of them. But that'll probably be another talk for a different time how we go and add extensions and handle that. This one's an optional one that I added in. Git lens is another optional extension that I added, which is really helpful if you're Git heavy workflow. It has you looking to see last versions of changes made. Pretty much gives you a glimpse into your project. Azure is an optional one that I added. This gives me access to my Azure resources. Same thing with Kubernetes. And everything else down here are all extensions. So you also notice that there's really no menu in here. There's a menu within Windows, or within the Mac, but in this case provides basically file, edit, and view. There's a Go, which allows you to do some shortcuts. Run, which allows you to do debugging. For the most part, a lot of what's done in Visual Studio Code, and this is based on my experience, is done without the mouse. So you'll see a lot of it's done with keystrokes, which is why there's pretty much a keystroke for everything. So let's go and open up an existing project. If we go and open up that previous one, because Visual Studio Code does not have the concept, I don't have that project on here. Because Visual Studio Code doesn't have the concept of solutions, I'm just going to open up the folder and we'll see the differences. So the welcome screen is always there until you close it. It opens up by default. But here is everything else. So this mirrors, since we opened up a folder, you're essentially doing, in my case, Finder. On the Mac, in Windows, you'd be looking at a Windows Explorer view for it. So it shows every directory, including the GitHub directory, the .IDE directory, which is for JetBrains, ReSharper, bin, docs, all the other folders, as well as the Docker specific stuff. If you notice in Visual Studio, these 4 or 5 Docker files were not there, because Visual Studio kind of lumped them all together for us. So we look at the source, go back to our application core. I believe we looked at entities and then base entity. Click on that. We get a similar version of the IDE with some subtle differences. You notice there's no drop-down list up here to indicate where we are going. This right here is a feature of the Git lens product that tells me the last person to edit this file was Steve Smith 3 years ago. This is essentially this is an open source demo project that I use for some of my presentations. But you'll notice there's also a toolbar here. This toolbar varies slightly. This is all geared around the except for the run code, everything around the Git lens product. So I can do blame, I can fast forward through changes, I can go back to see any changes with this file, or I can run the code. Most of the stuff you'll see in Visual Studio Code, though, is done through keyboard shortcuts. So there is a let me cover this dialog box. It comes up every once in a while. Notifications, just like in Visual Studio, come up here and allow you to, or it's either the Visual Studio's prompt or a plugin's prompt. Hey, this is something I need you to take a look at. If you want to see them again, you can click on here. In this case, it's telling me that required assets to build and debug are missing from eShop on the web. Add them. This is coming from the C# extension. Essentially, the C# extension said, hey, you're in a C# program. Do you want me to download the latest version of the SDK as well as the debugger options for it? You can choose yes, not now, or don't ask again. I'm going to choose not now because I don't want those to interfere. You notice there's a whole bunch of other items on our toolbar in the bottom. These all vary depending on the number of plugins and add-on. Consistent ones are here, the notifications, the language type. This is automatically detected by Visual Studio Code. You can also click on it and overwrite it. Let's say I really don't want this to be a C# file, but it really should be a closure file. Don't know why you do that, but in some cases it makes sense. Like if I open up this YAML, it detected it as a Docker YAML, but I can go and change it to an Azure Pipelines YAML if I wanted to. But you also have probably seen they call it command view. I forget the actual name, but if you hit the Control key and P, or if you're on the Mac, the Windows P, the Command key and P, it opens up a navigation. This allows you to kind of jump to any file you want or any part of a file in here. It provides full IntelliSense, so I can start typing things and it figures it out for you. If you do Command Shift P or Control Shift P on a Windows device, you get the tools window. This allows you to execute assorted tools. Like I mentioned, most of this stuff is command line, and a lot of stuff within Visual Studio Code are plugins and add-ons. So here, the first thing you see, which is my most recently used, is MS SQL Connect. So this is a plugin to Visual Studio Code that allows me to connect directly to SQL Server databases. So I can do Shift Command key C and automatically open that, or hit Enter to open it since it's the most recent, or I can type something. Let's say, because this is a Git project, I want to pull down the latest. I can do Git pull, select it from here, but since it's one of the most recent ones, I can just select it. Or I can type the words pull and see all the different options that I have from. So I have a generic Git pull. I can pull an image from Docker registry, pull a repository, and so on. So I'm going to just do the Git pull. It's going to go and open up an output window below in a second. It actually might not even open it because I already have output window selected. I'll have to select the type of output. You'll see here there are a lot more output types to it. Here, as Visual Studio Code loads the extensions, it populates them if they have a output window. In this case, the code setting sync was the last thing to run, which is why it's at the bottom of the list. If I go to Git, we'll see the outline of the actual command. So here, if I scroll to the very beginning, it's looking for the version. It found the version. It opened up the repository. Now it's doing a fetch. Excuse me. As soon as I did the pull, it went to the repository and now doing a comparison and eventually gets everything I have. You'll see that your mileage may vary, but by default we have 4 different tabs here. One is for problems. This is similar to the error list within Visual Studio. This lists any problems with your current project. Now these problems could be code problems, they could be configuration problems, it could be spelling errors. It really just depends on the plugins. So I have a couple of different extensions. I have some spelling ones in here because my spelling is terrible. But I also have some what are called linting tools that allow me to check the quality of code. In this particular case, in this project, it's running through a bunch of linting and checking the source code. You could tell by this C# IDE 0044. This is telling me it's running through the linting. But if I open up other tools, you might see spelling errors in here or markdown errors. Debug console is blank right now. If I was to run this project, I would have debugging ability, which I'll cover in another stream. And then the terminal window, like I mentioned a couple of times, Visual Studio Code is very command line oriented. So as you would imagine, there is a built-in command line tool to it. Essentially, this runs a shell into whatever your terminal shells are that you have registered on your system. As soon as you click on it, by default, it pulls in whatever you have listed as your default, which is a preference in Visual Studio, which I'll cover in a second. In my case, I have it set for the ZHS shell as opposed to the default bash shell in Windows. But I also have bash installed here as well as PowerShell, so I can select those. If I was to click on the plus button, it would generate a new tab so I can have multiple, and then I can delete them as needed. If I selected the default, it pops up a window with all of the registered terminals that I have on this machine. So I have bash, CHS, dash, PowerShell, and ZSH. I pretty much only use ZSH and sometimes PowerShell if I need certain modules loaded. One thing I haven't showed you was Visual Studio Preferences. So like I mentioned, this is just a shell. There is no real editor for preferences. There is a mock one. It's kind of low level, but it's a lot better than the previous versions. So just like any other Mac, if you do the Windows key or Command key and semicolon, you get these settings. By default, it'll show you this basic editor, which shows you some of your settings, but not all of them. These are only the common ones that Microsoft put in there. In order to view the actual settings, you would have to open up the settings file, which is, where is it? We'll see in a second. But this shows us all the settings. You'll also notice at the bottom this window popped up. I happen to have a add-in called Code Settings Sync that synchronizes my settings across devices. As you noticed, I have a Windows VM, I have a Mac VM, plus I have a separate Windows laptop. So this keeps my settings synchronized across. So if I add in one extension here, it's added to all three platforms. So here you can go through and check all the settings. If you want to look for a setting like font, this will narrow it down to any window or any setting that has the word font in it. Here we see that there are 42 settings found, and here's the different sections. So I can see under debug what the console app is. Here it's saying use the default. I can change the size of it. So if I change this to 16 and tab away, if I come to the console, you notice that this font size has increased. And to make it a little bit more dramatic, I'll move away and you see that that font size is different. You can also edit them by going up to preferences and then where is it? There is a, let's just check the command palette. So if I go to preferences, I have the option here to open up the local backup. I just want to open the preferences. Here I can do open settings, which is this user interface, or open the user settings. The user settings within the application are actually just a JSON file. Why don't you open up? Oh, there it is. They moved it to a button. So now if I check this, I have all the settings available. If you're doing something in a shared ecosystem where you want to have the same settings across the board for multiple members of your team, you can take this file, check it into source code, and then have it available. I won't scroll through this whole file because there are some secrets in here, which is a bad thing, but for the most part you can edit it directly here or edit it outside. These are all the ones for that sync setting, some of the SQL Server connections I have, etc. So I think that's it for now from a Visual Studio Code IDE. Tomorrow's stream will kick it off with the kind of half-hour walkthrough of JetBrains Writer. Apologize for some of the stream issues. Noted I won't be showing any Windows stuff here, so tonight and tomorrow I'm going to focus on swapping out and getting Streamlabs, OBS to work on the Windows device in case I want to show anything in Windows. But tomorrow, since we're working in Writer, I'll show that just from this Mac. That being said, I am done for now. If there are any questions, comments, feel free to leave them in the chat. I'm going to pop up my social media. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, or view my website, which has different blog posts like introductions to IDEs. Thanks again. Sorry for the choppiness. I'm going to have to find a better solution for that.